Hey, maybe you've heard musicians talk about minor seconds, augmented fourths, diminished sixths, and you're wondering, what the heck are they talking about? Well, I'm going to explain it to you. Today, we're going to talk about intervals. Intervals are a very important fundamental of music harmony. And once you get the idea of intervals, which is really just the distance between any two pitches, once you understand that premise, all sorts of other harmonic principles make a lot more sense. Scales, chords, on and on. So I'm going to go ahead and give your intervals now a more formal definition. Think of your bottom note as 1. And then the second note up from there is your second. And then the third note up from there is your third. And the fourth note up the major scale is the fourth. Fifth, the sixth note up the major scale, and their seventh note. Okay? But it's not just the number. We're going to have an adjective attached to the number. So they're pretty easy to remember though. From a major scale, seconds, thirds, sixths, and sevenths are all called major intervals. So it's not just a second when you play C to D. It's a major second. And it has a little bit of a dissonant sound, but not too bad. And then it's not just a third, it's a major third. Major sixes and major sevenths. The other ones we didn't talk about are called perfect intervals. So that means the fourth is a perfect fourth, and the fifth is a perfect fifth, and you can also have a perfect octave. And notice how all three of those sound very stable and easygoing. Octaves, fifths, and fourths. Now, that's it for major scale intervals. There are no other possibilities, but you're thinking, Dr. Ackerman, what about these black notes and what are those other words I've heard about with diminished intervals and augmented intervals? I'll explain it to you. If you take any interval that is a perfect interval and lower it, we call it diminished. So for instance, take our perfect fifth, and instead of C to G, we're now going to play C to G flat. We call that now, it's still a fifth, but it's called a diminished fifth because we took a perfect interval and lowered it by a half step. Now if we take any major interval and lower it by a half step, it becomes a minor interval. So here's our major third, and I'm going to lower it a half step, so now we call it a minor third. Here's our major second, lower it by a half step to a minor second, and a major sixth becomes a minor sixth. Major seventh, minor seventh. Okay? But this is not called a minor fifth because it was a perfect interval to start with, and that is called diminished when we lower it. The one we've left out is when we raise an interval. This is where it's a lot easier. Anything that we raise by half step we call augmented. That's it. So if we take a major second and raise it, it's now an augmented second. And this is where things are a little bit more interesting because that interval can now have two different names, right? It can be called an augmented second or it can be called a minor third. Well, which one is it, you might be asking? It just depends on how it's spelled on a piece of paper. If it's written D sharp or E flat, well then that tells you if it's going to be called an augmented second or a minor third. If I just played this for you and said, hey, what interval am I playing? And you could just hear that it's the C and the note D sharp or E flat, you could call it an augmented second, or you could call it a minor third, and you'd be right, because you're just going by what it sounds like. If it's written on a piece of paper, though, if it's spelled out specifically, well, then there's only one answer. Same thing here. If we have C to F, that's a perfect fourth, and now if we play C to F sharp, that's an augmented fourth. Whereas if we take a perfect fifth and lower it by a half step, same two pitches, but it would be given a different name depending on how it's spelled. All right? Now something a little bit more advanced, but you might want to keep in mind, is these intervals are always determined by the bottom note up. So if we have a different note in the bottom than C, like for instance G, well now all of our intervals are derived off of the G major scale that has the F sharp in it. So for instance, the major seventh above G is an F sharp, and if we were to make it a minor seventh, then we lower it to the white note. So it just depends on how the notes lay out from the major scale up from the bottom note, and that's how you determine the interval names from there. So it wasn't that simple. Take any interval from a major scale, it's either a perfect or a major interval, and then if you raise it, it's always augmented. If you lower it, it's either a diminished or a minor interval, and that's how it works. So if I were you for homework, just go through all the notes of the octave and give them a name. So C to D flat, that's a minor second. Here's a major second. Here's a minor third or an augmented second. Here's a major third. Perfect fourth, augmented fourth or diminished fifth. Perfect fifth, augmented fifth or a minor sixth. Major sixth, augmented sixth or a minor seventh. Here's the major seventh, and then a perfect octave. So now the next time you hear musicians talking about all these fabulous interval names, you'll know what they're talking about. You can be right part of the game. All right, now get to rock and have a good week.